Welcome to the Power Book of Podcasts. Unlock your potential with powerful book summaries that inspire personal growth and broaden your understanding of the world. Each week, we explore life-changing ideas, from leadership to mindset strategies to keys for happiness and success. Learn actionable insights to apply in your daily life. Join our growing community of thinkers and seekers. Like, comment, and hit that subscribe button now. It's time to supercharge your mind with the Power Book of Podcasts.
All right, so we're going to be diving deep into anger management today. You've given us a really interesting collection of material on this topic, including some excerpts from the Anger Management Best Practice Handbook. Looks like you're ready to not just control anger, but actually understand it, and maybe even harness this powerful emotion.
And you've picked a great time to dive into this, because the way we think about anger has actually gone through, well, some fascinating shifts over the centuries. Did you know that back in medieval times, excessive anger could actually land you in hot water? Like accusations of witchcraft hot water?
Okay, that's definitely adding some fuel to the fire for me. I'd be pretty angry about a witchcraft accusation. So how did we go from fearing anger as like a supernatural force to trying to actually manage it?
Well, around the 18th century, the idea of the family as a peaceful haven began to take root. This shift in thinking sort of set the stage for anger management to emerge as a concept. People started seeing uncontrolled anger as a problem that needed solving, rather than just a natural outburst.
So before we unpack all the ways we can manage it, let's define what we're talking about here. What is anger exactly?
Yeah, it's more than just feeling mad, right? The Anger Management Best Practice Handbook defines it as a strong feeling of displeasure or hostility.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is that anger isn't just one thing. It's like a spectrum, ranging from mild irritation all the way up to full-blown rage. It's understanding those different levels of intensity that helps us start to get a handle on it.
So sometimes it's just a simmer, and sometimes it's a full-on boil over. Right. And I think we've all experienced both ends of that spectrum at some point. But why does anger feel so powerful, like physically powerful?
That's because it's tied to our survival instincts. Remember the fight or flight response. When you sense danger, real or perceived, your body kicks into gear, your heart starts racing, your muscles tense up, and hormones like adrenaline and noradrenaline surge. And guess what? Anger triggers that exact same response.
So that feeling of being ready to explode is literally our body preparing for action. But that can't be good for us in the long run, right? Especially if we're constantly getting riled up.
That's a great point. And there's actual scientific evidence to back it up. Dr. Leo Maddow, whose work is referenced in the handbook, found some pretty concerning connections between anger, hypertension, and even brain hemorrhages. Essentially, holding on to anger chronically can be like slowly poisoning yourself from the inside out.
Wow, that's a serious wake-up call. So while we all get angry sometimes, it seems like understanding what sets us off is a crucial first step in learning to manage it. What are some of the common triggers the handbook talks about?
Well, the handbook makes a very important distinction between internal and external causes of anger. External triggers are the things that happen to us, like getting cut off in traffic or having a frustrating day at work. We can't always control these external factors, but we can control how we react to them. That's where the internal triggers come in.
So it's not so much about what happens, but how we interpret those events.
Yeah.
Our own personal buttons, so to speak.
Exactly. And one of the biggest internal triggers is the feeling of being rejected or invalidated. For example, the handbook talks about a wife who gets angry when her husband asks her to run errands. On the surface, it's about the errands, but underneath, it's about feeling like her contributions aren't appreciated, like she's being taken for granted. Her anger is a response to that perceived lack of respect.
And it's not just spouses, right? The handbook also mentions teenagers who feel constantly talked down to by their father. Again, it's about that feeling of not being seen or valued.
Right. And that brings us to a really fascinating point. Anger is often tied to our basic needs, things like respect, validation, even safety. When we feel like those needs aren't being met, anger can be a way of trying to protect ourselves, to reassert our worth.
So anger can actually be a form of self-preservation.
Yeah.
It's almost like a warning signal that something is off, that our boundaries are being crossed.
Absolutely. The handbook even encourages us to ask ourselves, when I feel angry, what need of mine is going unmet? Where am I feeling threatened or disrespected? Taking the time to answer those questions can really help us get to the root of our anger.
Okay, that's already making me think differently about those heated moments. It's not just about stopping the anger. It's about understanding the message it's trying to convey. But it's not always about feeling personally attacked, right? Sometimes anger can come from a sense of injustice, like when we see something that goes against our deeply held beliefs.
You're absolutely right. The Handbook has a great example of an LTO, someone who meticulously plans everything, who gets incredibly frustrated by his superior's constant mistakes. The superior is inexperienced, but the LPO's anger stems from his deeply held conviction that things should be done a certain way, a conviction that's constantly being challenged. It's like witnessing a violation of your personal code of conduct.
So even witnessing something like a mother mistreating her child in the grocery store could trigger that same type of anger, right? It's not directed at us personally, but it still feels like a threat to our values.
Exactly. And that just underscores how complex anger really is. It's not just a simple emotion. It's tied to our deepest needs, beliefs, and even our sense of safety in the world. So we've laid the groundwork uncovering the roots of anger and the triggers that set it off. But knowing is only half the battle, right? What can you actually do when you feel that anger rising? When your fight or flight response kicks in? That's where the Handbook's practical advice comes in.
Yeah, I'm definitely ready to move from the theory to the real world application here. I think a lot of us can relate to feeling like we're about to lose control. What does the Handbook suggest for those moments when you feel like you're about to blow your top?
Well, the first thing is to remember that anger management isn't about suppression. Bottling things up only creates more pressure in the long run. And the Handbook even warns that it can lead to some serious health consequences down the road, like heart disease and even an increased risk of cancer. It's like ignoring a warning light on your car dashboard. Eventually, something's going to break down.
So ignoring it isn't the answer, but neither is letting it explode all over everyone. It sounds like finding that middle ground, that balance between suppression and expression is key. What are some of the specific techniques the Handbook recommends?
It starts with understanding your personal anger patterns. The Handbook talks about the difference between passive and aggressive anger. Passive anger often shows up as manipulative behavior, self-blame or withdrawal. It's that simmering resentment that can poison relationships over time.
It's like this silent treatment on steroids, right? Where you're stewing in your anger, but not actually addressing the issue.
Exactly. On the flip side, you have aggressive anger, which is much more outwardly directed. This is where you see things like yelling, threats, verbal abuse, even physical violence. It's that explosive energy that can cause a lot of damage in a short amount of time.
So it's not just about how intense the anger is, but also how it's expressed. That makes me wonder, does everyone fit neatly into one of those categories? Or can you be both passive and aggressive depending on the situation?
That's a really insightful question. And in reality, most people fall somewhere along a spectrum. You might tend toward one style more than the other. But it's also influenced by the specific triggers, the people involved, and even your own emotional state at the moment.
That makes sense. So once you start to recognize your own patterns, the signs that your anger is starting to build, what can you do to intervene before it takes over?
The Handbook has a really simple but effective technique called cool downs. It's all about interrupting the fight or flight response by literally removing yourself from the situation. Remember, when your body is flooded with adrenaline, your ability to think clearly goes out the window.
So it's like hitting the pause button before things escalate. I can see how that would be helpful, especially if you're in a situation where the tension is really high.
Exactly. Even something as simple as saying, I need a moment to collect my thoughts. And stepping out of the room can give you the space to calm down. And while you're taking that time out, the Handbook suggests another technique, talking yourself through it. It's about using reason and positive self-talk to counteract those automatic negative thoughts that fuel the anger.
So instead of thinking, this is so unfair, they're always doing this to me, you could try something like, okay, this is frustrating, but let's focus on finding a solution.
Right. It's about replacing those hot thoughts, the immediate, often irrational reactions, with cool thoughts that are more balanced and constructive. And the Handbook provides a really interesting framework for understanding these hot thoughts.
I'm all ears, because I think we all have those knee-jerk reactions that we wish we could control better. What does the Handbook say about them?
Well, it identifies several common types of hot thoughts that tend to fuel anger. One is blaming others, making them the sole source of your frustration without taking any responsibility for your own role in the situation. Another is catastrophizing, blowing things out of proportion and assuming the worst-case scenario. And then there's mind reading, where you assume you know what other people are thinking or feeling, often with negative assumptions.
Oh, I'm definitely guilty of that one. It's so easy to jump to conclusions when you're feeling angry, but how do you actually catch yourself in the middle of those hot thoughts? It seems like they happen so fast, almost automatically.
That's where the practice of cognitive restructuring comes in. It's not about denying your feelings, but rather learning to recognize and challenge those automatic thoughts that are feeding your anger.
So it's like training your brain to hit the brakes before it goes careening down the anger road.
Exactly. The handbook gives some great examples of how to reframe those negative thoughts. For instance, let's say your partner is late coming home, and your immediate thought is, they're so inconsiderate, they never think about how this affects me. That's a classic blaming thought.
Yeah, I can see how that would just escalate the anger. So how would you reframe that thought?
Instead of assuming the worst, you could try a more balanced perspective. Maybe there's traffic or they got caught up at work. I'll wait a few minutes and see what happens. It's not about letting your partner off the hook, but rather giving them the benefit of the doubt and avoiding jumping to conclusions that only fuel your anger.
Okay. That's a much calmer approach. It's like choosing to see the situation through a less judgmental lens.
Right. And sometimes those hot thoughts aren't even accurate. We tend to overgeneralize, using words like always or never to make the situation seem worse than it is. So instead of, they never listened to me, you could try, they haven't been very receptive to my ideas lately, and I need to figure out a better way to communicate with them.
It's like taking the power away from those sweeping statements that just amplify the negativity. But what about those situations where you're not just angry, but you're also feeling hurt or betrayed? Those emotions can be really hard to disentangle.
You're right. And in those cases, the handbook suggests taking a step back and focusing on self-soothing techniques. Remember, anger is often a secondary emotion, a reaction to something deeper like sadness, fear, or hurt.
So sometimes it's about addressing the underlying wound, not just putting a Band-Aid on the anger.
Exactly. And that's where things like meditation, deep breathing exercises, or even listening to calming music can be incredibly helpful. These techniques help to calm down your nervous system, allowing you to process those more complex emotions without getting overwhelmed by the anger.
It's almost like giving yourself a mental timeout to regroup before jumping back into the ring. But sometimes, even with all the cool thoughts and deep breathing in the world, you still need to express your anger. How do you do that in a way that's constructive, not destructive?
The handbook emphasizes that healthy anger expression is all about assertive communication, being direct and honest about your feelings without resorting to attacks or blame.
So it's about finding that sweet spot between being a doormat and being a bulldozer. How do you actually strike that balance?
Well, the handbook suggests using I feel statements. Instead of saying, you always make me so angry when you do that, try shifting the focus to your own experience. I feel frustrated when this happens because it makes me feel like, It takes the blame out of the equation and allows you to express your emotions without attacking the other person.
So it's like saying, hey, this is how your actions are impacting me, rather than you're a terrible person for doing this. That makes a lot of sense.
Right. It's about creating a dialogue rather than a battleground. And another crucial tip is to focus on the future, not the past. Dwelling on past grievances will only keep those negative emotions churning. Instead, try to frame the conversation around finding solutions and preventing similar situations from happening again.
Yeah, it's like that saying, holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. It just hurts you more in the long run.
Exactly. And sometimes, even with the best communication skills, you still need an outlet to process those intense feelings. The handbook actually suggests writing a letter to the person you're angry with, but with a very important caveat: don't send it right away.
Okay, I've heard of that technique before, but I always wondered, what's the point of writing it if you're not going to send it?
It's about getting those raw emotions out of your head and onto paper. It can be incredibly cathartic to just let it all out without worrying about hurting the other person's feelings or escalating the conflict. But the key is to sleep on it before sending.
So you're giving yourself time to cool down and reread the letter with a clearer head.
Exactly. You might even decide not to send it at all. The process of writing can sometimes be enough to help you process and release the anger. And when you do communicate, remember to stick to the facts. Avoid accusations and focus on expressing your feelings and needs in a clear and assertive way.
So it sounds like self-awareness and self-care are really at the heart of anger management. It's about understanding your triggers, having those go-to coping strategies, and knowing how to communicate effectively.
And it's about recognizing that you're not alone in this journey. Anger is a universal human emotion. We all experience it, and it's okay to struggle with it sometimes. The important thing is to keep learning, keep practicing those techniques, and keep striving to express your anger in a way that's healthy and constructive.
Well, you've certainly given us a lot to think about today. We've covered everything from the surprising history of anger management to the nitty-gritty of cognitive restructuring and assertive communication. It's clear that anger is a powerful emotion, but it doesn't have to control us.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a question to ponder. What are your hot thoughts? What are those automatic reactions that tend to fuel your anger? And how can you start reframing them to create a cooler response? Remember, you have the power to choose how you react, even in the heat of the moment.
That's a great takeaway. Anger doesn't have to be the boss of us. By understanding our triggers, learning to cool down, and finding healthy ways to express our feelings, we can take back the reins and use this energy for positive change. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of anger management.